So we've all heard of Indian summer, but have you heard of Indian winter? That's when the dog days of summer in mid to late August turn into the brisk, chilly air of autumn. That seems to be the situation we're in here in the back half of August, right before Labor Day. It won't be long now before we're out in our combines harvesting corn, but it's still a little early to tell whether or not wide variation in our weather patterns from the beginning of the month to the end, what kind of effect that's going to have on our soybean crop. But it's been a hot minute since we've recorded an episode, so we're going to waste no more time and get right to it. I'm Luke Byers, and you are listening to Gab in the Cab. Happy Labor Day, everybody. We haven't officially recorded an episode of the podcast since probably early June. So we've got a lot to catch up on since then. A lot of things have been going on in the world of agriculture. It seems like every time I record one of these episodes, we always start out by talking about the weather. We are in a weather pattern currently where the temperatures are just in the basement relative to where they usually are this time of year. Middle to late August, we're still looking at average highs in the upper 80s. Still very normal to see low to mid 90s. But I think I saw one of the cooler forecasts. It's next Thursday. Now, granted, that'll be the beginning of September. Looks like September 4th. They're forecasting a high in the upper 60s and a low of 43. The first subject that I want to touch on before we get too late in the year is considerations for controlling volunteer wheat prior to going into wheat planting. So we're in the area of the state where a lot of times our planting window for winter wheat is going to be basically starting September 15th and going forward from there. And one of the things that we've been really trying to emphasize as an extension system throughout the state of Kansas is hammering home the importance of controlling volunteer wheat. And the reason that that's important is because of a little tiny bug called the wheat curl mite. And the wheat curl mite is a bug that vectors the wheat streak mosaic complex of diseases. And so this includes the wheat streak mosaic virus, the triticum mosaic virus, and high plains disease. So this complex of diseases are all really detrimental to our hard red winter wheat production in the state of Kansas. And historically, we haven't really had a big problem with it in the north central part of the state. It's usually been considered a Western Kansas disease, but in recent years, probably just the past 3 years specifically, we've been seeing a lot of problems with it throughout this area of the state, and more so than we have in the past. And so there's a couple things to keep in mind whenever we think about wheat streak mosaic virus in particular that kind of need to have us put our ears up to make sure that we're taking care of it. Number one is that it's a viral disease. So it's a virus. It's not a fungus where we can spray a fungicide. This is something that the only method of management is prevention. And the only method of prevention is making sure that we don't have wheat curl mite populations in our winter wheat. Now, the fortunate thing about that is that the wheat curl mite, which vectors the virus, does not overwinter in Kansas. They overwinter way further south in Mexico and Texas, and then they get blown up by the southwestern winds throughout the course of the wheat growing season. Starting in coming out of dormancy and hollow stem and so forth, and they survive over the summer months. But they can survive over the summer months until essentially the first killing freeze. So what that means is, by the time of the first killing freeze, we've already got our wheat stand growing. Well, if there are wheat curl mites out in the field, feeding on volunteer wheat at the time that we have a new stand of wheat popping out of the ground, then they'll naturally be able to move into those fields, start feeding on that new wheat that's coming out of the ground. And while they don't do a whole lot of damage whenever they're feeding because they're so infinitesimally small, what they do is they transmit the virus. And a lot of times the symptoms won't show up in the fall unless you've got a really, really late freeze. But the virus is still in the plant system. A lot of times the symptoms won't show up until green up. And then you've got trouble on your hands because when the virus is in there, it really hampers the development of the growth of the wheat plant throughout the vegetative and reproductive stages. And of course, we all know what that means: yield loss. My suspicion is that because we don't historically associate wheat streak mosaic virus with the central corridor of the state of Kansas, that it is not as fresh in people's minds to think, I need to go out and control my volunteer wheat to make sure that I don't have the wheat streak mosaic virus out there. So that's one possible explanation of why this has become a problem, or why it's at least been exacerbated in our area. The volunteer wheat element is so critical to the disease propagation is because the life cycle of these wheat curl mites is such that they're only going to survive for a couple of weeks, if that, after their food source, these cereal crops, are eliminated. So if they end up in a barren wheat field, say in mid to late August, several weeks prior to wheat planting, then they're in a situation where their population is going to be completely died off, and the only way you're going to get reintroduction of wheat streak mosaic virus is if you have more curl mites coming in from the south. Formerly, the recommendations from K-State Plant Pathology were eliminate the green bridge, i.e. control for your volunteer wheat, really all of your volunteer cereal crops, 2 weeks prior to wheat planting. Now, as a means of precaution, they've extended that backwards to be a full month, a full 30 days. And that puts our section of the state, Clay Cloud, Republic, Washington counties, in the August 15th to September 15th window. So if you say, well, I need to control my volunteer wheat by August 15th, why are you telling me to it now? It's the tail end of August. Well, the reality is it's never too late to control for your volunteer wheat. So in a way, it's if you want your insurance policy to cover you, do the whole month. But if you still want to have some prevention, go out and spray right now. There's no time like the present to control for your volunteer wheat. And then possibly, if able, maybe you could delay your planting of wheat for an extra week or something like that. So these are just general guidelines, but because you didn't hit the August 15th quote unquote deadline does not mean that it is not in your interest to go out and control for volunteer wheat. So keep that in mind as we enter into the time of year where we're going to start thinking about doing field work to prepare for planting our winter wheat crop. The next thing I want to talk about as we're entering this late summer, early fall time period is a pest that has come into our part of the state just recently, just within the past few weeks, and has really wreaked a lot of havoc on some of the people and their fields in our area, and that is fall armyworms. So I've heard some people say, and there are some reports that the fall armyworm wave, that came in at the beginning of August, is kind of subsiding in a lot of the areas where it was showing a lot of signs of damage. It's always good to hear those reports. However, I just encourage people to be vigilant in this regard because fall armyworms can have the 2 generations, and it causes a lot of damage in our grassy species, especially. These caterpillars like to feed on the heads of milo, eating a lot of the seeds that are in the head there. Another particular favorite of theirs is going to be brome. So I've heard on multiple occasions just in the past few weeks, they have wiped out entire stands of brome. Interestingly enough, they will also go after alfalfa. I've even heard people say that they will go after soybeans if there's nothing better to eat. So they're a pest on many different fronts. And especially whenever we think about a crop like milo, which already susceptible on a variety of fronts to damage and yield loss. We're entering a stage where a lot of our milo crops, especially if they're full season milo, are entering their coloring and coming into maturity. that can be a major problem. One of the things that we want to consider are, A, how do we control for it? And B, when do we control for it? So there's a slew of different products out there. I'm not going to go into the details of each product and what crops they're available for use as insecticides to control for fall armyworms. But one of the things I will just mention is that one of the biggest decisions we have to make whenever we're coming across pests like these that seem to come along and devastate within a moment's notice is, okay, when do I pull the trigger? So whenever we're talking about fall armyworm control, the thresholds for control, as in whenever it's going to be effective to control them, in alfalfa, 1 to 2 caterpillars per square foot can destroy seedling alfalfa. So if you've got a brand new stand out there, 10 to 15 caterpillars per square foot can destroy alfalfa that's up to a foot tall. So that's something to keep in mind, is if you want to save your alfalfa crop, those are kind of the thresholds you want to keep in mind whenever you go out and scout for armyworms. Not a whole lot of concern in corn, but that's something that people tend to ask about, is it going to damage my corn? Not a huge amount. I would be more concerned with things like earworms or rootworms rather than armyworms whenever it comes to corn. Milo is the one of our row crops that it's going to damage the worst. 1 to 2 larvae per head can reduce yield by 5 to 10%. One of the things you have to keep in mind is understanding your own yield environment, your own yield goals. What is 5 to 10% as compared with the cost of controlling? So these are the things that just to keep in mind. Winter wheat, the larval stage will do what they call window painting. They'll basically chew window panes in the vegetative state. It's usually the second generation that's going to cause problems in wheat. And the treatment threshold for wheat is going to be at 2 to 3 feeding caterpillars per square foot. Brome grass or cool season grasses, typically treatment won't be warranted until 4 to 5 caterpillars per square foot. So a little bit of a higher threshold than wheat. But as a general rule, we're talking 2 to 4 fall armyworms per square foot or per head in the case of sorghum or milo. So just some things to keep in mind. So keep scouting for it, and make sure you're doing a cost-benefit analysis of treatment as well. The last major item I want to talk about today is a discussion on the provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed in July and its effect on crop insurance and Title I commodity programs. Specifically, the change that was made to crop insurance was that previously you could only enroll in SCO if you were in PLC, price loss coverage. That is gone. Starting in 2026, whenever you go to enroll in either ARC or PLC, you will be able to enroll in the supplemental coverage option, which is a subsidized crop insurance policy that covers up to 86%. So for example, if you have a revenue protection policy that covers up to 80% of your yield, or your revenue rather, SCO will provide coverage from 81 to 86% at a subsidized upcharge. So that's the main change that's happened on the crop insurance front. The rest of it comes down to the Title I commodity programs. That would be the Ag Risk Coverage, ARC, or ARC, and Price Loss Coverage, PLC. The first major provision that implements change is that for the 2025 crop year, so the crop year that we are in, that we're starting to enter harvest for, the commodities title of the farm bill is going to pay out to farmers the greater of ARC or PLC. You get the higher of the two, so it doesn't matter what your election was for 2025. Starting in 2026, regular enrollment is going to resume with the Farm Service Agency. And that enrollment for ARC or PLC is going to be the standard method of the Title I commodities program until 2031, through the 2031 crop year. Another thing to keep in mind, statutory reference prices for PLC they've been raised from anywhere from 11 to 21%, depending on the commodity. So in PLC, there are two prices to consider. One is what they call the statutory reference price, and the other is what they call the effective reference price. The PLC statutory reference prices were raised for corn. Originally it was $3.70, now it's $4.10. So at the statutory reference price level, what that meant was below $3.70 is whenever those PLC payments started kicking in, if the statutory reference price was what was established as the effective reference price. Now, if it's below $4.10 for the marketing year, that's whenever payments kick in. So what it does is it increases the likelihood of payouts from PLC because it raises the floor below which the marketing year average price must fall before a payment is triggered. Wheat's effective reference price went from $5.50 to $6.35. So that's a raise of 85 cents there. And soybeans went from $8.40 to $10, which is the rates of $1.60. Other thing is that every year that statutory reference price is going to go up by 0.5% starting in 2031. So it's going to stick at these new levels from 2026 through 2031. Then it's going to start going up starting in 2031, and is going to be capped at 115% of the new original statutory reference price. There's a chance that all of this goes out the window by 2031, depending on when we get around to redoing the Farm Bill provisions. However, this is the law of the land starting in 2026. Other thing to keep in mind, so that was PLC. The other thing to keep in mind is ARC payments. So ARC payments are calculated by comparing county actual revenue and county benchmark revenue. So these are terms that are used in the Title I language to kind of define how these payments are calculated. So actual revenue is calculated by using the market year average price times the market year average yield. And that's using the 5-year Olympic average. So think the past 5 years, essentially, 2020 through 2024, drop the highest price and yield and drop the lowest price and yield for each of those. And then that's how you calculate your benchmark revenue. And then you use the actual revenue and compare it against it. So say, your county's average yield was 120 bushels of corn at $4 a bushel. Then your actual revenue for this year was $480 an acre. Then you compare to the benchmark revenue and say, well, average for the past 5 years, dropping the highest and the lowest was actually 150 bushels at $450. So our revenue is going to fall below that. And if it falls sufficiently below that, then we'll get a payment. It used to be that if you fell below 86% of the benchmark revenue, then you'd get a payout. They lifted that 86% to an 87.5%. So if the actual revenue for your county falls below 87.5% of the benchmark revenue of using the past 5 years data, then that's whenever a payment gets triggered. Previously also, the maximum amount of payment that you could get was 10% of that benchmark revenue. So say you had a benchmark revenue of $500 an acre, the maximum you could get per acre was $50. That's actually been raised to 12.5%. So if my math serves me correctly, the maximum in that case would no longer be $50 an acre, it'd be $62.50. So potential there for higher payouts on ARC. So that kind of changes the math a little bit whenever we're just trying to decide whether we're going to go with ARC or PLC. But we will have more tools developing the trade-off simulations of different scenarios when we get closer to those times. So stay tuned to all that. One last thing about the Farm Bill that's changed. The commodities title payment limit per owner-operator was previously $125,000 per operator. So the total amount calculated from ARC or PLC that you could have received in the past was $125,000. Now it is $155,000. So it's an increase of $30,000 per owner-operator. The other thing to keep in mind is that previously, LLCs and S corporations were treated as single individuals, so you would have a single payment limit for an LLC. Now they will be treated as general partnerships among the owner-operators in that enterprise. So, for example, if you have, 3 brothers that own an LLC or an S corp, their payment limit per each of them would be $155,000, rather than just having one payment limit for the LLC or the S corp. So that kind of expands the payment limit available to some of those business structures. So in a way, it re-incentivizes incorporation whenever it comes to an ag policy perspective. So all of this information is like drinking from a fire hose, but helping you navigate all of these different decisions is what we're here to do at the River Valley Extension District. So if you have questions about any of the information that I've covered in this episode today or on previous episodes, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We've got offices in Clay Center, Concordia, Belleville, and Washington, covering Clay Cloud Republic and Washington counties. And it's our mission to make sure that you have the best information available to make the best decisions for your family farm. I'm Luke Byers, and you've been listening to Gab in the Cab.